I'm Ruth Poor, and I made this. My paintings tend to be complicated and have a lot of layers. This painting is titled Lady in Waiting. The size is 72 inches by 48 inches approximately. And the materials, I created this giant embroidery hoop from birch plywood. I created this in help with my father. We used clamps that I had, clamps that he had, my grandfather and my great-grandfather. All of that I count as being sort of material properties in the process of creating this frame, this stretcher, and also a sort of vise that holds all of this together. On its interior, I use a combination of painting, textile, and screen printing. And I usually use those three in a somewhat symbolic sense. And I'm interested in the dialogue that it creates from having those pieces exist together, not just the high and low between painting and craft, but also the repetition of values using screen printing. Like down here, I have these Masonic symbols. And so I think of that repetition of values being passed through in rural spaces primarily, but using all of these different elements to talk about high and low, to talk about the passage of value through generations, especially. These stars are screen printed as well. I wanted to look kind of like an American flag, or at least using the blue part of it, which I dyed with indigo, which has a very loaded history, especially in terms of colonialism. I did quite a bit of stitching for the leaves up here, so a lot of my process in creating this was starting off with the screen printing layer first, and then I would bring it into the sewing machine, stitching in more detail, and then using a embroidery machine as well for some of these leaves. This section here, it's actually fuzzy, and then the final layer on top of it is painting. For the painted parts, because I'm acknowledging its place in the hierarchy of art making, painting for the last layer, it was interesting because I was thinking like, oh, this could be erasure if I'm covering up certain things. This could be an accessory. I could accessorize it instead, making it just be on the periphery of something. I'm interested in the violence that takes place in rural spaces. Violence in this piece, I think of the passage of what it means to be a woman in a rural space has very archaic, and it just follows along with this sort of patrilineage and this erasure of anything else that isn't a monolith of white Christian femininity. And so existing in a rural space outside of that representation of femininity is risky, and it's often something that's policed by other women. It's not until I really started to take education into my own hands and push myself further as an artist, taking more power for myself, that I started receiving that violence and erasure from men. But for the most part, I'm used to seeing that type of violence, women influencing other women as to the way that they're supposed to act and dress and exist within certain environments. So in this painting, I wanted a figure that was part of this landscape and part of this background, pulling in a lot of fibers into her physical self while having this sort of painted version of someone that seems to be collaged into the space, someone who's like sort of invading it. But I wanted to play around with those with those tropes by using the material and the imagery, and taking this from these different layers of colonialism I see as being tied into how moral architectures are designed with these little flourishes of religion, or it's a very the illusion of a rural space is deeply tied in with colonialism and religion and erasure and duty and repetition. And so I want to explore all of those things and even just go through my memories of these places, trying to understand why the environments are the way that they are and in what ways I can resist that through my making.